Romans chapter 11. Romans chapter 11, beginning in verse 11 is where we are. Romans 11, beginning in verse 11. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for the blessings that you've given to us. We are thankful for texts such as we're studying this morning and we've been studying for the last 2 quarters. What a rich addition to the New Testament that helps explain the gospel, helps explain our role in the gospel, our place in the gospel as your covenant people. Help us to reflect upon this humbly, that we can be faithful to the commission before us. Pray you'll be with our shepherds in this congregation as they're helping us to walk faithfully before you. Please be with their families as they support them. Be with our deacons and their families. Pray you'll be with each of us as members of this congregation. Help us to take advantage of opportunities to share your gospel with the lost world around us. The very rich things we've discussed in this study of Romans, things we can share, things the world so desperately needs. Please be with us in our study this morning and all those in the back, and then in our worship after that. We ask this in Christ's holy, perfect name. Amen. All right, Romans chapter 11. I want us to kind of remember some of what's been happening in chapter 11. In this text, chapters 9, 10, and 11, let's think about what's been going on. You may remember we talked a little bit. All 3 of these chapters are feeding out of a comment made earlier in chapter 9. Does anybody remember where it is, what it is? Verse 6. I heard somebody say it. What's the premise behind Paul's point in verse 6, the first half of verse 6? The word has not failed. The word has not failed. That is a good thing to remember as we're studying chapters 9, 10, and 11, because everything in chapters 9, 10, and 11 goes back to that premise. That is Paul's proposition. Chapter 9, verse 6, and the first half of it. It is not that the Word of God has failed. Everything in 9, 10, and 11 reinforces that point. Okay? And so, as you're getting in, you see the heart of Paul in this chapter more than you do in a lot of places. I mean, chapter 9, he's saying, man, I want Israel to get this. In chapter 10, he says, my heart's desire and prayer is that Israel might be saved. But Paul is not praying Israel will be saved in spite of their rejection of Jesus Christ. The point is, I want them to be saved by accepting Jesus the Messiah. That's how they're going to be saved. And that is the only way they're going to be saved. And so, he talks about this remnant in early chapter 11. And so, just as Elijah, our man, and Elisha, our men this month, Russ is going to discuss that in the lesson this morning, just as Elijah once felt so abandoned and totally lost and without anything and anybody, he says it's the same today. Paul felt very alone in Romans 11. You can see that. I mean, you think we grew up, most of us, in a very Christian culture. But man, just imagine being Paul, raised in the Jewish faith. Remember us talking about some of those texts last class. You've got texts like Galatians 1 where he talks about his role in Judaism. You've got some of these statements in chapter 10. You've got these statements in 1 Corinthians 11 or 2 Corinthians 11 verse 22. Paul was a deeply devout Jew. When he became a Christian, folks, he was ostracized by his own flesh and blood family, kinsmen, Jews. He felt very alone. And I think the sentiments he expresses that Elijah expressed in 1 Kings 19 were very personal for Paul. He feels alone. And yet, he's not alone. Just as Elijah was not alone, Paul is not alone. Christians are not alone. And believing Jews are not alone. And so, brings up some of the Old Testament quotations in verses 8 through 10. We talked about some of that, the commonality of those 3 verses. Romans 11, 8 through 10. The commonality is that they basically, because of their stubbornness, their rebellious spirit, they're refusing to see, refusing to hear, and then, of course, refusing to respond. Does anybody have any questions on any of that stuff? We didn't have a lot of time to discuss it at the end of class Wednesday. All right, Romans 11, verse 11. We're going to read down through verse 22, and then we'll do the questions as our custom has been. So Romans 11, verse 11. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not. But through their fall, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Now if their fall is riches for the world, and their failure riches for the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. If by any means I may provoke to jealousy those who are my flesh and save some of them. For if the casting away of them is the reconciling of the world, what will the receiving of them be but life from the dead? For if the first fruit is holy, the batch is also holy. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. And if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and the fatness of the olive tree, do not boast against the branches. But if you boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off, that I might be grafted in. Well said. Because of the unbelief, they were broken off, and you stand by faith. Do not be haughty, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, take heed lest He also not spare you. Therefore, consider the goodness and severity of God. On those who fell, severity, but toward you, goodness, if you continue in His goodness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. All right, we got about 3 questions that pertain to this section. Let's go ahead and look at those. Just these 3 questions or so here. Question number 5. Who is the they in verse 11? They. Unbelieving Jews. Unbelieving Jews, absolutely. Second question to that. What happened as a result of their fall? Salvation to the Gentiles. Question number 6. What did Paul hope to accomplish in his Gentile ministry? Provoke the Jews to jealousy? Anybody else have something different? Bring them into right relationship with God. Yeah, fundamentally. Fundamentally, that's what he's after. He wants, remember 10, verse 1 and 2, he wants Israel to be saved. The only way they're going to do that is through Jesus Christ. Question number 7. In Paul's illustration, who is the natural branches? I think it should be who are the natural branches. I love typos in my material. It makes me humble. It makes me humble. So who are the natural branches and who are the grafted in? And what is the overall point of the illustration? Jews who are the grafted in. Well, let's specify this. What kind of Jews are we talking about? Believing Jews. I think you got a little bit of both, by the way, and we'll see that in the context. Yeah, grafted in, but they didn't take. We'll play with that in a minute. And then somebody said the Gentiles, they're the grafted in, but believing Gentiles. Okay, and then I forgot the question because it was so long. Yeah, the natural branches and then the grafted in. And then what are the overall point of the illustration? Boy, I tell you what, once in a while you guys will summarize it better than I could. I was chewing on this and thinking, I don't think I could summarize that in one sentence. And Charles, you busted it off there like you should be up here. I'll go sit down. All right. Anybody have any other questions on those particular questions? Okay, well, let's work through this text a little bit together then. All right, back up in verse 11. I say then. Paul does this a lot in this text and in Romans. I mean, we've seen this. It's like he's just going to make a big statement. He's going to turn right around and he's going to reinforce that argument. So let's make sure we get this. That's kind of the point. Let's make sure we get this. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Stumble and fall are almost synonymous. Okay? I mean, I think we even get that in the English. In the English language, stumble is basically falling. Okay? But the point is, have they fallen so as to be completely lost? Are they totally gone, irrevocably lost? Now, his answer is absolutely not. That's what he says in verse 11. Absolutely not. They have not fallen so as to be lost eternally, forever, and there's nothing they can do about it. That's not his point. He wants them to be saved. Remember, that's how chapter 10 starts. But they're going to have to change, and they're going to have to come to King Jesus, and they're going to have to accept the Messiah of God. So they've not fallen, they've not stumbled to fall and stay dead, essentially. Okay? Larry?
When you think about that, now when we stumble, we don't necessarily fall to the ground.
Sure.
We can catch ourselves. They could help
Yeah,
themselves.
yeah.
They could have done something that's kept them from falling completely.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you're going to see skillful way Paul interweaves some of these concepts. I'm not going to get ahead of myself, as excited as I might be. I'm not going to. But you'll notice the stress on belief later in this illustration, verses 16 and following. That's the whole problem. Had they believed in the Messiah, they could still be saved. And exactly as Larry pointed out, they stumbled, but if they'll pick themselves up by believing in the Messiah, they won't be lost forever. And so there's a warning involved in this text as well. So he says, the last half of verse 11, but through their fall, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Once in a while, the New King James will fail me. And I lament the days it happens. This is worded kind of choppy in the New King James. The New American Standard, I believe, renders it a little bit better by just shifting some of the phrases. Jack, you use the New American Standard, don't you? Would you mind reading that last clause of verse 11? You see that? It shifts it just a little bit. Shifts it just a little bit, makes it flow a little more naturally. He has just described the fall, the stumbling and the falling of the Jewish people, but that it is not irrevocable if they'll come to the Messiah. But here's what God did with it. God capitalized on their mistakes, on their failures, so that salvation could come to the Gentiles. But part of what that was accomplishing, this is the transcendence of God's wisdom, folks. Remember chapter 8? He talks about all things work together for good to those that love the Lord. Remember we talked about that's not about temporal things. That's not, oh, I had a car accident and so God's going to work it to good for my benefit. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about big stuff, salvation. This is exactly what he's talking about. His entire covenant people rejected his Messiah, Jesus Christ. What did God do with that? He capitalized on it. You're going to reject my Messiah? Salvation will now go to the Gentiles. And then, what God's going to do with that even further, he's going to provoke some of them to jealousy that they still might come to the Messiah. So as the Jews are watching this new covenant people form, the Jews, some of them, not all of them, some of them, will in turn be jealous for this and they'll go after the Messiah too. So God, it's almost like threefold here. God's going to use their failure to still accomplish his good purposes. Everybody kind of see that here? This is a big deal. Big deal in this text. God capitalizes on the failures of Israel and still accomplishes his good purposes. Okay? Now, provoke them to jealousy is a very biblical concept. And it depends, the subject is different depending on the context. Sometimes God is provoked to jealousy, and sometimes his people are supposed to be provoked to jealousy. And so, you read that depending on the context, but this is to incite them to change. And it's kind of the idea. Jews watching Gentiles come into the Messianic kingdom would hopefully make them want to be in the Messianic kingdom. Paul's going to say more on that in just a second. Verse 12. Verse 12. Now if their fall is riches for the world, and their failure riches for the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? You'll read through some of these passages and it will challenge the way you think. It will challenge the way you think about God And I think in some respects, folks, we have such a shallow view of God's work in the gospel. Studies like Romans ought to help us with that. He says their fall, that's the Jews. Their fall is riches for the world. Now, Paul likes the term riches, uses it a lot. You could actually go and read entire sections where riches are talked about. Ephesians 1 and 2 especially talks about the riches we have by being the people of God. Those are temporal riches that foreshadow eternal riches. Everybody get that? We talked about that a little bit in chapter 5 in verses 1 through 5. We have temporal peace, but it foreshadows eternal peace, right? We have salvation, but it also foreshadows salvation, eternal salvation. And so all of those concepts are woven together beautifully. One foreshadows the other, the bigger, the greater, the actuality of it all. And so you get some of that here. Riches for the world, the salvation to the Gentiles, verse 11. Riches for the world here in verse 12. You've got, through the failure of the Jews, you've got the gospel that goes forth to the world. Sounds like a little bit like the Great Commission, doesn't it? Go into all the... That's where you fill in the blank. We'll try it again. Go into all the world and preach the gospel. That's the whole point. The gospel, through the Jews' rejection, is going to the world. Now, I want us to think. This rejection of the Jews, or their fall, the word rejection will show up in just a second. The fall here, what would you think of? When you say the fall of the Jews, if you were going to put that on one single event, what event would that be? There you go, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. That's the great fall. Now think about this in the terms of redemption. When they fell, they crucified Jesus Christ. What did God do? He raised Jesus from the dead, and then the gospel goes forth into all the world. You see how God is still the subject matter here? God takes the mistakes of Israel, the failures of Israel, the fall of Israel, and He capitalizes on it for the sake of the world. So He says the riches will go to the world, their failure, riches for the Gentiles, very more specific. Not just the whole cosmos, which is the word world here, the whole cosmos. This is riches for the Gentiles. All people are going to be benefited by this failure of the Jews because God made it so. Then he says, how much more their fullness? Well, there's a lot of debate about that, the fullness there, or some translations even say the fulfillment. I think we got to be careful reading beyond Paul's illustrations. Okay, you can get into some false doctrine pretty quick if you're not careful. But essentially, if we wanted to think about this in very simple terminology, what if Paul were to say, you think the rejection of the Jews towards Jesus the Messiah was a big deal? Wait until you see how many of them come to Him later. Would that make sense? It's almost this comparison. So their fullness, this is only the beginning. The gospel will continue to go, the gospel will continue to be preached, and many more will come to it. Lots of discussion about that. Maybe we could have some more at another point. The argument shifts a little bit. So does anybody have any questions on verses 11 and 12? All right, verse 12. For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. Verse 13, I speak to you Gentiles. It's emphatic language. I'm speaking to you Gentile readers. He's going to shift this discussion just a little bit. Some people take this little spot and they say, okay, well, the majority of the Roman church or churches would have been Gentiles. That's not what the text says. That's not even a really clear indication from the text, okay? It's just Paul shifts his argument a little bit. Remember in 9, 10, and 11, he's predominantly speaking to Jewish Christians. So this little spot here, he goes, y'all need to sit up and pay attention to, because I got some things to say to you about this same subject matter. So I'm saying this to you, Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles. So as far as it concerns him being an apostle to the Gentiles, I want us to think, if you were a Jew, well, even if you were a Gentile Christian, if you were a Christian in the first century, Paul is a devout Jew who then comes to Jesus Christ and becomes a Christian. Would it not be fairly natural for you to think, man, even Paul has turned away from his own people. The Jews are just, no more. This is a Gentile religion now. Wouldn't it be kind of natural to think that? I mean, if you're just looking at Paul's actions, they don't get more devout Jews than Paul. And even he's turned away from the Jewish people. Even he's now preaching to the Gentiles. He's going to kind of very skillfully defend that. And he's going to say it in verse 14 especially. But that little phrase, I magnify my ministry, that's kind of leading into that discussion. Paul is magnifying the apostolic mission of the Gentiles, but for a particular reason. Not because the Jews are rejected irrevocably, not because the Jews have been discarded by God and there's nothing they can do about it, but in hopes that some of them might still come to Jesus. Man, okay, I'll get excited. I'll stay in the text. You can see the wisdom of God. At the end of this chapter, Paul is going to make one of the most beautiful praises of God, doxologies, one of the beautiful praises of God because of His unsearchable riches and wisdom. Folks, this is what he's talking about when he says something like that. The wisdom of God in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Verse 14, let's connect this to verse 13. He says, if by any means I may provoke to jealousy those who are my flesh and save some of them. So see what he does. Somebody outside looking in says, well, Paul's an apostle to the Gentiles. Even he's disregarded the Jews. He clarifies in verse 14, no. It's not because I've just done away with the Jews. It's not because God has done away with the Jews. It is to accomplish the very thing he said in verse 11, but now in verse 14, through the agency of the human apostle. I want some of them to be jealous about this, and I want some of them to come to Jesus Christ, that he might save some. I want you to notice this. In verse 11, it seems to be the wisdom of God, the gospel itself, that's provoking people to jealousy. Verse 14, he very clearly says, I may provoke them to jealousy. That's through the work of the Apostle Paul. That's why he's magnifying his ministry, verse 13, his work. Because he wants to accomplish this. He wants to provoke some of them to jealousy. And again, it's still very personal that he might save some of them. Who saves sinners? Jesus. I would have accepted God as well, or the gospel. There's several answers that would have been appropriate. God is who saves sinners. But you notice what Paul does here? He emphasizes the human role in salvation. That I might save some of them. God's the one who saves them, but you remember what we talked about in chapter 10? How beautiful are the feet of those who bring the gospel, the good news. Folks, that's our job. That's Paul's job. That's my job. That's your job. That's our work, that we might save some of them. Just like Paul, we need to have this hunger for our kinsmen, that we might bring some of them to the feet of King Jesus, that we might save some of them. That is our duty, my friends. And it is a very serious duty, and you can see Paul stress that here. He wants to provoke the Jews to jealousy so that he might save some of them. Now, notice that, some of them. How much did Paul preach? Man, how many sermons did he preach? How many Jews did he convert? Did Paul ever have a day of Pentecost like Peter did? Peter stands up in Acts 2 and preaches, and over 3,000 souls are added to the saved. You ever read about Paul doing that in Acts? Me neither. But Paul was a diligent worker. His efforts were to save some, though he could not save all. Well, I'd like to say more on that, but we better press along. Questions or comments on any of that section? Phyllis? You're right. There could be a positive element. You're exactly right. There could be a positive element to Paul's conversion. Exactly what we talked about in the earlier part of chapter 10 and chapter 11. Why would Paul refer to his Jewishness? Because he's a prime example of what a Jew was supposed to do. Be faithful to God through the law. Now the gospel is here through Jesus Christ. What does Paul do? He does what every good Jew should do, accept Jesus Christ as the Messiah. Phils, you're exactly right. I just want you to see the negative and the positive here, okay? Any other questions, comments? Are you waving at me? Okay, all right. I'll wave back. I didn't know for sure. It was you, David. I wasn't sure, though. Yeah, that's okay. Just be careful who you wave at. You may get called on for comments. All right, verse 15. Verse 15. For if the casting away of them is the reconciling of the world, what will the receiving of them be but life from the dead? You'll notice verse 15 repeats several of the concepts in verse 11, 12, and 13, and a little bit of 14. The casting away, that's the idea of the falling, okay? The stumbling and the falling of verse 11, but it's in stouter language. Casting away, he says, if the casting away of them. The subject is the Jews, right? But you notice something about that term, casting away? It's passive. It's passive. This denotes God's rejection of these people. God's rejection of these people. He says, if God's rejecting of these people leads to the reconciling of the world, what will the receiving of them be but life from the dead? We've come across this word several times, we have come across this word reconciling or reconciliation. Does anybody kind of remember generally what that means? To be reconciled? This is a big one, guys. To bring back. Look, think about it like this. I don't know if you remember things like this. This is what helped me years ago. Reconciling in very simple concepts is to restore. Reconcile is to restore, with special emphasis on a relationship. So it is to restore to a relationship. So, I'm sorry? To make whole. Yeah, absolutely. And essentially, if you want to connect this to theological concepts, to reconcile ourselves back to God is to make us whole. Okay, I'm gonna throw several things together for you really quickly. You know what the concept of salvation is? To be made whole. You get why Jesus goes about healing people in the Gospels? It's because He's making them whole. And so He's doing something in physical terms, in the physical plane, in physical reality, that represents what He's actually able to do in the spiritual realm. He heals the crippled man of his physical disease. And what does He say in Mark 2? What's easier, to tell the man to get up and rise and take his bed and walk, or to tell him that his sins are forgiven? But you know the Son of God can do both. I'm going to tell him his sins are forgiven and to get up and walk. I mean, man, folks, that's what this is all about. Salvation is to be made whole. It is to be reconciled back to God. Okay. All right, so he says their rejection, their casting away, is the reconciling of the world. Now, we need to make sure we understand, Paul is not a universalist. He is not saying that all people, the whole cosmos, which is again that term, is going to be restored to God. But he does mean that the opportunity for reconciliation has now been opened up to the world. Does everybody see that? That's kind of an important concept there. Gospel does not teach universalism. Does not teach everybody's going to heaven and God's saving everybody. No, but it does teach that everybody who wants to be saved will be saved. Only through compliance with King Jesus, I might add. But that's what he's promising here. So he's, okay, here it is. The casting away, their rejection leads to the reconciling of the world. What will the receiving of them be but life from the dead? It's again, how much more? That's the argument. You think it's like this, but how much more will it be when things work out like God is going to bring them together later? Some of the concept here. Life from the dead is a very, very difficult phrase. You don't actually have it anywhere else in the New Testament. So if you, in the Christian theology, life from the dead, what do we think of first? I say life from the dead, what's a word you think of? Our word. Resurrection. Come on, guys. Come on. Keep it snappy. Resurrection. That's exactly right. Resurrection. Now, I'm not entirely sure whether Paul's referring to a resurrection here in a literal sense, the general resurrection at the end of the age, or if he's talking about just simply a raising what was once dead to life. I'm not going to fist fight you in the parking lot, whichever one you take, okay? But I sometimes think that he implies both. Remember we said a second ago, there are statements in the New Testament. Actually, there are statements in the entire Bible where the statement will be made. There is an immediate application to that subject, but then there's an ultimate application to that subject. Remember the one I just mentioned a moment ago? Peace. We have peace now with God, Romans 5, verses 1 through 5. But that foreshadows our ultimate peace, the serenity we will have in the presence of God in heaven. Okay? Some of the same thing may be going on here. Life from the dead, a dead nation, now alive through the gospel. Verse 16. He's going to start this illustration. We're going to try to get through this. For if the first fruit is holy, the batch is also holy, and if the root is holy, so are the branches. That is a parallelism. So the first half of the verse mirrors the second half of the verse. He's probably pulling from Numbers 15 and the offering to God. So you would have this essentially it was like leaven. You would take part of it and offer it to God. That was obviously the holy portion. But then holiness would then offer to the rest of the material. Right? That's how that worked. You offer a part and it sanctifies the whole. Now, he is not saying here, okay, he is not saying that some of the believing Jews who come to King Jesus are now so holy that their holiness spreads to unbelieving Jews. I read some people that believe that. That's not what he's talking about. It's not what he's talking about. But I do think he is talking in somewhat of a reciprocal nature. So this holiness will spread. This holiness will spread. And all of it goes back to these roots, kind of a big deal in verses 17 and following. So let's put that together. Verse 17. If some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and fatness of the olive tree, do not boast against the branches. Okay, so if some of the branches were broken off, who are the branches that are broken off here? Jews, but let's zero it in a little more. What kind of Jews? Unbelieving Jews. Unbelieving Jews. They are the branches here that were broken off. Okay? And you, who's the you here? Who are you? No, I'm kidding. So who's the you? Gentiles. Gentiles. That's right, Gentiles. So, two classes of people right here mentioned. Unbelieving Jews who are broken off. You, being a wild olive tree. That means Gentile believers are the wild olive tree here. He said, we're grafted in among them. Now, I need to be careful. Paul is sometimes a big fan of grammatical consistency. Sometimes he's not. Them is not the branches that were broken off. Okay? We read that in English, and that's kind of what we might connect it to. But that's not what he's talking about. Probably it's a reference back to the root. And so you've got them being the believing that remain. So you're grafted in among them, and then became partakers of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. Wild olive tree, kind of an interesting phrase. So you've got some horticultural things going on here. And if you know me, I am an expert with horticulture. I have a tree in my front yard and 2 in my backyard. I'm a pro at this. So I know all about it. So you have this image of wild is the uncultured. You think about a wild tree growing versus one that's nurtured in a tree farm. They're not the same trees, folks. Okay? They can still be the same makeup, but they're not the same trees. And that's kind of the image that's being used here. So you've got some branches that are being cut off and thrown away. You've got some that are being grafted in. Who's the one doing all the branch cutting and the grafting? Who's the one doing that? Jesus, God. That's exactly right. Notice again, passive language. The branches are not cutting themselves off. God, in judiciary action, is cutting them off. And He's grafting others in. Okay? And so they being grafted in, notice this, they've become partakers of the root and of the fatness of the olive tree. Notice the singularity here. Olive tree. There's only one tree. Only one tree. Remember us talking earlier in Romans? There's a big push in Romans for unity. Big push in Romans to be united together. It's not Jew and Gentile. The gospel is not unique to either of you. It is for all. And so it is the gospel to the Jew first and also to the Greek, 1:16. Some of those are kind of being pulled in here. There's only one tree. And the Gentiles are being grafted into it. So what did not have the nurturing, it did not have the environment, now it does. Partaker is a favorite word of Paul. Same word that we get sharing together. It's the same word we get fellowship from. And it's always spiritual in nature. It's always significant. It's not the coffee and the donuts and basketball. You never see it used that way in the New Testament. You always see it used in very significant terms. We're united in our suffering. We're united in our spiritual pursuits. We're united in King Jesus or in the gospel message. Lots of stuff like that. Never coffee and donuts. But for the record, I'm not sure there's a Greek term for coffee. You get back to me on that. All right. So here it is. They're partakers of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. Make sure you see that. That is kind of the mooey-gooiness of the gospel. This goodness that these people had. They have nothing, but because God grafted them in, now they're getting the rich sustenance in the vineyard. God likes vineyards. Isaiah 5, if you're kind of a note taker, margin writer, Isaiah 5 is a great little section. I believe it's verses 1 through 11. Talks about Israel being God's vineyard. He sets them up. He gives them opportunity. He plants them in the right spot with the right water, and they've got everything they need, and yet they do not make fruit. And what does God do? He's going to thin the vineyard. Some of the same stuff's being done here. God, when He uses terms like this, folks, even the tree grafting and branches, folks, what do branches produce? Fruit. Fruit. You think I can get evangelism out of this? You see that? See what we did here already? Folks, that's the duty, that's the obligation, that's the job that we have. Unproductive branches are broken off. Unbelieving branches are broken off. And then God grafts in the others. So verse 18, do not boast against the branches. You remember Paul's warning in chapter 2, verse 17? He warns the Jews, don't boast. You are arrogant in your claims that God is yours and yours alone. You're arrogant in your observance of the law. Don't boast. But now he balances that spectrum. He turns to the Gentiles and he says, guys, don't boast. You are never anything more than a branch that was grafted in by the will and grace of God. You're not the root. You're not the foundation. You're a part of the tree. That's it. That's it. A tree that's nourished and supplied by God. And so he says in verse 18, but if you boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. Now, please understand, he didn't say don't boast in verse 18 to turn around and say, okay, well, when you do boast, it's okay if you boast. No, that's not his point. Okay? So this is maybe not the best translation right here of the word boast. He is challenging that mindset through and through. Don't do that. We have got to stay humble about our place in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Larry? Oh, yeah. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 10:12, take heed lest you fall, absolutely fits right here. Folks, we have got to make sure we see our place in the gospel. And do you think New Testament Christians need this warning today? You better believe it. We are nothing. We are nothing but servants of God Most High. I want us to think, maybe an illustration would help here. We got to hurry. I'll make a quick illustration. You look at a house. What matters more, the frame or the foundation? Foundation. But are they not complementary? If you have no frame, do you have a house? If you have a frame but no foundation, do you have a house? You see what he's doing here with the tree and the trunk, or the tree and the root? Folks, we're branches. That's all we are. Remember, Jesus uses some of the same imagery in John 15. Okay? We are the branches. We sing a song about this. We are the branches, the Lord is the vine. What is the name of that song? Fruit of the Spirit. I knew I'd get it. I didn't even have any help. Thank you, thank you. All right, let's move along here. So they support the branches. And again, bearing fruit. Verse 19, you will say then, branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well said. Okay, let's think about that, because I love the way Paul does this. He's not afraid of putting words into the mouth of his potential arguer. Well, you might say, they were cut off so we could be grafted in. Well, yes, but also no. And you're going to see Paul work with that. Well said. No, you're absolutely right. They were cut off. But you're wrong about the other half of that statement. See what he does now? He says, well said, verse 20, because of unbelief they were broken off. So you're right, they were broken off. And you stand by faith. Do not be haughty, but fear. Now notice, the last half of their statement in verse 19 is not correct. They were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Paul says, well, they were broken off, but it was because of their unbelief. It wasn't so you could be grafted in. You're not that special. Now, you're being grafted in, though. Okay? Just make sure you keep a perspective, proper perspective about where you stand in this message. You stand by faith. Okay, all right. What is the opposite of stand? Fall. Kind of a big word in this context, isn't it? How many times has he said stumble or fall? Go back up to verse 11. They stumbled, or have they stumbled that they should fall? Verse 11 in the last half, but through their fall. Verse 12, now if they fall, see what he's doing? They fell, they fell, they fell, they fell, they fell. Verse 20, you stand. Here's how they stand, though. Not by their own might, not by their own superiority, not by their observance of the law of Moses, but by faith, by allegiance to King Jesus. They're going to stand, and only through King Jesus will they stand. But guys, make sure you see that. He's building that argument in a brilliant fashion. They fell, they fell, they fell, they fell, they fell. You stand. And the only way you're going to continue to stand is by faith. Isn't that part of why they fell? That's what he just said. They fell because of their unbelief. You stand by your belief. Make sure you see that, okay? Because that is a powerful part of that argument. The last phrase in verse 20, do not be haughty, but fear. Do not be haughty, but fear. So again, reinforcing that argument, don't be arrogant. You better stand in reverence for God, fear of God. I don't like to delineate. Oh, it's reverence for God. Oh, it's terror of what God might do. I know our culture's afraid of talking about how they should be afraid of God. That's a biblical concept. You know, Russ and I both like that subject because it's something that impresses both of us. We're supposed to be afraid of God. We're supposed to be afraid of what God could do to us. But that doesn't mean we live in terror, just like our Father. You're afraid of what your Father could do to you when you were a child? You should be afraid of what God the Father can do to you because you are a child. And at the same time, you revere Him, respect Him, admire Him. You are in awe of Him. All of the gospel, folks, is about what God could do to you because you're a sinner, but what God doesn't want to do to you because you're His child. Okay? All right, very quickly, let's put some of this together in verse 21 and 22. I think I got 2 minutes. For if God did not spare the natural branches, take heed lest He not spare you. Therefore consider the goodness and severity of God. On those who fell, severity, but toward you, goodness, if you continue in His goodness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. Notice the phrase in verse 21, the natural branches. He didn't spare the natural branches. The natural branches would be those in the vineyard. Those who He planted, those whom He nourished, those whom He supplied all of this stuff for. Paul says He didn't save them. He was willing to cut every one of them down that were unproductive. What do you think He'll do to you? I'm going to tell you, that's a sobering warning. This is exactly why He says you better fear in verse 20. He said, take heed. He's not going to spare you if He didn't spare them. Verse 22, therefore, because of what He said, consider, you survey, you look at, you examine the goodness and severity of God, kindness and severity of God in the New American Standard. That is the only place, stay with me just a second, that is the only place you find those phrases used in reference to God, the kindness and severity of God. That is a sobering warning. We could do a lot on that one verse. We're not going to take the time, obviously, this morning. But I want you to just consider the warning is there, and the warning is real, the warning is serious. You better be careful that you stay humble and submissive in your service to God. Don't be haughty, don't be arrogant, don't do what the Jews did. You stay humble and submissive to King Jesus. But I want you to observe too, severity is on the table. But you notice what Paul repeats 3 times? Goodness. He says severity twice, goodness 3 times. What do you think he's emphasizing God's nature more?
One thing, one key word in verse 22. One key word is if.
Yeah, if.
We need to circle that, underline it, and if. And 1 Corinthians 15:2 says the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. Big little word there, if, in verse 22. Be careful, but see the goodness of God and be afraid of the severity. Appreciate your attention. Wednesday night, we'll finish up that chapter and make some applications.